Hi everyone, this is your instructor Josh, and I'm going to be talking today about one of my favorite subjects, oxygen transport and hemoglobin in the blood. So, first thing to take note of is the shape and the shape and function, so the form and function of the red blood cell. The red blood cell is a pretty weird shaped cell. It's shaped like this little donut-y thing with a nice little indentation in the middle, and that's a kind of weird cell shape for a cell to be. There's no other cell in the body that's shaped quite like that, so why is the red blood cell shaped in this particular way? And it has to do with a few things. So the function of the red blood cell is primarily to transport oxygen, and it's the hemoglobin molecule that transports that oxygen. There are two things that can control how much oxygen a red blood cell can transport. First, there is the amount of hemoglobin that it can carry. The more hemoglobin that it can carry, the more oxygen it can transport. But if the whole purpose of the red blood cell was to optimize the amount of hemoglobin that it could hold inside of it, then the perfect shape for it would be a sphere. The sphere is going to hold the most hemoglobin possible, but this is not a sphere, so there's a second factor involved as well. When red blood cells are moving through your lungs, they are only in your lungs for a short period of time, which means that the faster oxygen can diffuse into the red blood cell, the more oxygen it can carry. The speed with which oxygen can diffuse into the red blood cell is determined by its surface area. We've talked a lot about how surface area and maximizing surface area can be a very important component. So the red blood cell has a few important features in order to make sure that it can transport the most oxygen possible. First off, the red blood cell is basically just a sac for hemoglobin. Once they are made, they cannot reproduce. They cannot even make more proteins. Once they're made, they're just a sac of hemoglobin. So they lack all internal organelles. They lack mitochondria. Any energy that they need, they have to get through anaerobic fermentation. Fortunately, they don't need very much energy because all they're doing is moving around, and they've already got all of the hemoglobin that they're ever going to have. They also lack a nucleus and DNA and pretty much all other internal organelles. They eject those during their development to make room for more hemoglobin. So this shape of the red blood cell, where it's sort of shaped kind of like that right there, what this does is it allows the most surface area for the most volume of hemoglobin that it can have. So with this shape, you can still pack in a fair amount of hemoglobin, but all of the hemoglobin is going to be near the surface of the red blood cell so that it can get as much CO2 gas exchange as possible in the shortest amount of time possible. There are a lot of hemoglobins inside of a single red blood cell. There are up to 280 million hemoglobin molecules in one red blood cell. Now, while I said that the red blood cell's purpose is to transport oxygen, oxygen is not actually the only gas that it is involved in transporting. The red blood cell also has this enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, which we have talked about before. And carbonic anhydrase is an enzyme that will take CO2 and combine it with water, H2O, and it does this by forming, let's see if I can do a new color here, by forming a new bond with that oxygen there. That's going to cause this bond here to break and flip outwards, and it will grab hold of that hydrogen, breaking this bond here. And what you end up with is a molecule that looks something like this. And this, oops, sorry, there's another O there. And this molecule is what is known as carbonic acid. Carbonic acid, which just means an acid that contains carbon, or at least carbonate. And the acidic hydrogens are these ones right here. It can lose one or it can lose both, but usually it only loses one. And so this can then become what's called its analog base, its basic form, and this is a charged ion that is extremely soluble in water. So, what happens? How does oxygen get into the blood? Well, we know that oxygen gets into the blood in the lungs, and the lungs are filled with these little teeny tiny grape cluster looking things called alveoli that we'll talk a lot more about when we get into the structure of the lungs. The function of the alveoli is to increase the amount of surface area inside of the lungs. The capillaries are going to run very, very close to these alveoli. And inside the lungs, there are a few things that have to happen before oxygen can get into the blood. First off, the oxygen in the atmosphere must dissolve in the water. Once it has dissolved in the water, and your blood is mostly water, the plasma of your blood is water, once it's dissolved in your blood plasma, it can move into your blood cells, but it has to dissolve in the plasma first. For carbon dioxide to leave the blood, and remember that when you breathe out, you're breathing out carbon dioxide, it has to go the other way, which means that you're going to have to turn that carbonic acid back into carbon dioxide, and then that carbon dioxide has to diffuse into the blood plasma, and from there leave the plasma and get into the atmosphere inside of your lungs, what's called the alveolar air. Now, we've talked about diffusion in the past, and when you think about diffusion in terms of things that are dissolved in water, it's very easy to figure out how things are going to diffuse. Things diffuse from higher concentration gradients to lower concentration gradients. But when you're talking about gases, it actually gets a little bit more difficult because it's hard to measure the concentration of of a gas. Gases expand to fit their environment. So a pure percentage is not necessarily going to be the best way to measure it. With gases, the best way to measure how they're going to diffuse has to do with partial pressure. And this concept of partial pressure is very important. Basically, what partial pressure is, it's governed by this thing called Dalton's law, which if you take chemistry, you can learn a whole bunch about. But it looks like there's a whole bunch of math going on here, but it's not that difficult. All that partial pressure, all that Dalton's law means is that the total pressure, I would say P tote, that's your total pressure, is equal to the sum of the partial pressures of the gases that make up your environment. So, for instance, in our environment, the air that you're breathing, the percentage of nitrogen percentage is about 80%. You can see here I'm kind of rounding up. It's actually about 78.6%, but let's round up for now. And the O2, oxygen percentage, is about 20%. And we know that at sea level, the total pressure is equal to 1 atmosphere. That's the definition of the unit atmosphere. It's the pressure, the air pressure at sea level. So the total pressure is going to equal the partial pressure of nitrogen plus the partial pressure of oxygen. So if there's a total of 1 atmosphere of pressure and nitrogen is 80% of the atmosphere, then the partial pressure of nitrogen is 0.8 atmospheres. And the partial pressure of oxygen is 0.2 atmospheres. And that's all that Dalton's law says. And you can measure these pressures individually. So if the partial pressure of oxygen is 0.2 atmospheres, it doesn't matter if that is a partial pressure of 0.2 atmospheres in an environment that has 1 atmosphere of total pressure, or if oxygen is the only thing around. The gas behaves exactly the same way, regardless of whether or not there are other gases around increasing the total pressure. You only need to consider the partial pressure of the gas that you're looking at. So in general, gases are going to diffuse down their partial pressure gradients. There is one other thing that is going to control how gases in atmospheres, gases in their gaseous form, are going to interact with and dissolve in water. And that is what is called Henry's law. And Henry's law basically says that the amount of gas that dissolves in any aqueous solution, in any water solution at a given temperature, temperature can affect this, but fortunately your body is mostly always at the same temperature, this is controlled by 2 things. First is the partial pressure of the gas. The greater the partial pressure, the more gas will diffuse in the liquid. Second is solubility. The more soluble a gas is, the more easily it will diffuse in the water. And what controls solubility? Well, what controls solubility with gases is pretty much the same thing that controls solubility with anything else. Remember, we said long ago that water has polar bonds, right? So we have this partial negative here, and this partial positive here, and this partial positive here. And so water is going to interact well with anything that has charges. The more charges something has, the more charged it is, the more soluble it will usually be in water. There are some other things that affect this as well, like the size of the molecule and stuff like that. But when we're talking about gases, it's primarily going to be dependent upon how polar the gas is. If you take a look at oxygen, right? This is 2 atoms of oxygen hooked together. There's no difference in electronegativity. So this is a nonpolar molecule, and it is not very soluble in oxygen, or in water. So not very soluble. If we take a look at CO2, well, this carbon-oxygen bond here, that is a polar bond. This oxygen is going to be partially negative. This oxygen over here is going to be partially negative. This carbon here is going to be partially positive. Now, how polar is it? Well, it could be more polar. For instance, this can't really do hydrogen bonding because it doesn't have any hydrogens attached to it, and it's a balanced polar molecule because you've got both of your polar poles are pulling in opposite directions. The molecule overall isn't polar, but these bonds are polar and they can interact with water. So this is more soluble. Now, if we look at CO2 in its dissolved form, remember we said that carbonic anhydrase is going to combine CO2 with water to make this molecule called carbonic acid, which will then dissociate into its basic form. And we'll see that this is charged, and ionic things, charged things, are very soluble. So, just to recap, gases are going to diffuse down their partial pressure gradients, and the amount of gas that can dissolve in any liquid solution is going to be proportional to the basically the difference in partial pressures between the gas dissolved in the liquid and the gas in the atmosphere, as well as the solubility of the gas in that liquid. Well, that's all well and good for the lungs, but the partial pressure of gases changes as blood moves through the body. And that's a good thing, because if that didn't happen, your blood couldn't deliver oxygen to your tissues. So let's take a look at what the partial pressures are in various parts of the body. If you take a look up here, let's actually start down here, right? So you've got new blood that is going into the lungs. Let's take a look at that blood. That blood comes in with a partial pressure of CO2 equal to 40 millimeters of mercury. So the partial pressure of CO2 is 40. Oh, sorry. Partial pressure of CO2 is 46. And the partial pressure of O2 is 40. Even deoxygenated blood still has some oxygen left in it, which is why you don't immediately die if you hold your breath. There's still some residual oxygen left in your blood. But this is deoxygenated blood, and it's going into the lungs. What does it meet in the lungs? It meets in the air that you have just breathed in. So that would be this inspired air here. And inspired air has a partial pressure of oxygen of about 159. And you'll note that 159 is a lot more than 40. So which direction is the oxygen going to go? Well, the oxygen is going to go into the blood, following its partial pressure gradient. Because there's a huge difference in this, 159 and 40 are pretty different numbers, it's going to move in relatively quickly, even though the oxygen is not very soluble. Now, let's take a look at the CO2. What is our CO2 pressure inside of our blood? Well, it's 46 millimeters of mercury. And what is the CO2 pressure in the air that you have just breathed in? Well, it is 0.3. It's effectively zero. There actually isn't very much CO2 in the atmosphere, which is a good thing, because if there was a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, you would not be able to breathe CO2 out. So what happens here? Well, the gases are going to equilibrate inside of the alveoli in your lungs. And so that means that as much oxygen is going to move into your blood as can, and at that point the partial pressure of O2 in your oxygenated blood is about 95 millimeters of mercury, and that's pretty much fully loaded. That's as much oxygen as you can really get into blood if you're a good, healthy person. So that's actually a pretty optimal thing, because you'll see that the alveolar air has dropped down to a partial pressure of 104. So there actually isn't now much of a difference between the oxygen content of the air and your blood. Not all of the CO2 is going to move out. Remember, CO2 is a lot more soluble in your plasma, so it doesn't really want to leave your plasma, but it will still equilibrate with the air around it, and you'll see that in the alveolar air, the PCO2 will rise to about 40 millimeters of mercury, and your CO2 levels in your blood will drop to about 40 millimeters of mercury. So CO2 has left. You then breathe that out, your expired air, and you breathe out CO2 and less oxygen than you breathed in. Okay, so now we have our oxygenated blood. Where is it going to go? It's going to go down to the tissues. What are the oxygen levels dissolved in your tissues? Well, it varies depending upon exactly what tissue you're looking in, but on the average, tissue fluid has a O2 pressure of 40 millimeters of mercury. So which direction is the oxygen going to go? It's going to go from this 95 to the 40. That's a liquid-to-liquid transfer, so we don't have to worry about the solubility aspects of it. It's just going to move down its pressure gradient, and that's what causes the oxygenated blood to drop off its oxygen. It's the difference in partial pressure between the oxygenated blood and the tissue. What is the CO2 content of the blood or of the tissues? It's about 46. That's going to equilibrate with the blood as well. 46 is more than 40, so CO2 will move from the tissues into the blood. And when those have equilibrated, we have our deoxygenated blood, which goes back to the lungs and completes our circuit. So, how fast do gases move in between atmospheres and liquids? Well, it depends. The greater the difference in partial pressures, the faster loading and unloading happens. So, for instance, with normal atmosphere, at normal atmosphere in the lungs, the partial pressure of O2 is 158. And at sea level, at 1 atmosphere of pressure, right? So the loading happens relatively quickly. Stick somebody in a hyperbaric chamber. This is a device where they actually put them at high pressures of pure oxygen, so 100% oxygen at 3 atmospheres of pressure. That means that the partial pressure of oxygen is about 15 times greater in a hyperbaric chamber than it is in standard sea level. This is something that you would put someone in if their blood oxygen levels are really, really low. Maybe they only have a partially functional lung. Maybe something else has happened. Maybe they've had a major amount of blood loss, so they just have less blood moving around, but you need to get a lot of oxygen to them really quick, and that's what this does. The 15 times higher partial pressure of oxygen means that oxygen is going to move into the blood much, much quicker. Conversely, take somebody, move them up to 10,000 feet, that's about 3 kilometers high, and you are lowering the partial pressure of oxygen at that elevation. That means that oxygen is going to move slower into the blood. That could be a problem to people who have who are anemic, who have low blood oxygen hemoglobin, who have other problems going wrong with them. If you have a problem with your blood, or if you have a problem with your lungs, it's usually not recommended that you live in Denver. So, we know how oxygen is transported through the body. It's almost all oxygen is transported bound to hemoglobin. About 98.5% of it is transferred bound to hemoglobin. Only about 1.5% is bound, dissolved in plasma, and that's because oxygen is not very soluble in water. Right? It has to be bound to hemoglobin in order to be transferred around. It doesn't want to be in the water. Carbon dioxide, we know, is a little bit more soluble in water, but even then, about 90% of the carbon dioxide is actually transferred in the form of carbonic acid. Remember, carbonic acid is really soluble in water. You can put a lot of carbonic acid in water, in plasma, and it will stay dissolved. This does have a consequence to the blood that we'll talk about later, but generally speaking, this limits the amount of acid that you want to add to your blood. About 5% of carbon dioxide is just dissolved as a gas in the plasma. That's a lot more than oxygen, but then again, CO2 is about 20 times as soluble as oxygen. And about 5% is transferred bound to proteins. Some of these proteins are going to be just blood proteins sitting around there that it's reacted with, and some of them are actually going to be hemoglobin. We'll talk about the consequences of that in just a second. First, let's take a look at hemoglobin and exactly what it is. Well, we know that hemoglobin is a protein, right? And hemoglobin is actually what's called a tetramer, meaning that it has 4 parts. There are 4 globin subunits in hemoglobin. There are 2 beta subunits, a beta, and there are 2 alpha subunits, an alpha and an alpha. Each of those subunits holds one heme. So one molecule of hemoglobin has 4 globins and 4 hemes, and can therefore transport 4 molecules of oxygen. Interestingly, myoglobin, which we talked about when we were talking about muscles, if you remember, myoglobin is that pink stuff that you see sort of, if you buy a steak, that sort of pink stuff that leaks out of the steak, that's not blood, that's myoglobin, and its job is to hold oxygen in the muscle cells, and it has only a single globin fold and only a single heme group. This is adult hemoglobin. Fetal hemoglobin has to actually be made specially because it has to bind to oxygen tighter than the mother's hemoglobin does, so that it basically can steal oxygen from the mother. The fetus has to steal oxygen from the mother, otherwise it doesn't get any oxygen and doesn't have lungs of its own. So it has to bind that oxygen tighter, and fetal hemoglobin is made with 2 alpha chains, same alpha chains, but instead of the beta chains, it has what are called gamma chains, and those gamma chains are shaped slightly differently so that it binds oxygen tighter. This down here, this is the heme group. Remember, the heme is not a protein, but it is an organic molecule, and the whole purpose of the heme group is to coordinate this iron right here in the center in such a way that that iron will reversibly bind oxygen. If you just take like iron, like a steel nail or something, and you let it sit in oxygen, it will bind that oxygen, and we call that rust, but that's not a reversible binding. When iron rusts, that's a permanent change. That would be no good for your blood. You have to have an iron that's going to bind oxygen and also let oxygen go. In order to do that, it has to have this coordination with the heme group. Now, we said that hemoglobin has 4 subunits, and it binds oxygen. These are 2 things that we know. There's basically 2 ways that some things can bind. There's what's called linear binding. Myoglobin binds linearly, by the way. With linear binding, you get a straight line. That means, let's say that we're talking about oxygen, right? So if something binds linearly, then doubling the amount of oxygen will double the amount of oxygen that is bound to the protein. Increasing the amount of oxygen by 20% will increase the amount of oxygen bound to the protein by 20%. Reducing the amount of oxygen by 10% will reduce the amount of bound oxygen by 10%. That's a linear relationship. Hemoglobin and oxygen do not have a linear relationship. They have what's called a cooperative relationship, and that's because you have those 4 subunits, right? So you have 4 subunits of your globin fold, right? When one of them binds to oxygen, it changes shape. All right? That's the first binding. This change of shape right here, see now, this square bit doesn't fit very well with these round bits around it. So this square bit that's bound to oxygen is going to cause the next one to change shape as well. That will increase the binding of oxygen to the second unit, which then increases the binding of the third unit and the binding of the fourth unit. So every oxygen that you bind makes the next oxygen more likely to bind. When you get 1 oxygen bound, you're more likely to get 2, and then even more likely to get 3, and then even more likely to get 4. And it goes backwards, too. If you lose one oxygen, you're more likely to lose the second oxygen, and more likely to lose the third oxygen, and more likely to lose the last oxygen as well. That produces a binding curve that is sigmoidal, right? That means that small changes can have very big results. See, it starts off slow, but then you have this really steep curve. Hemoglobin will tend to bind all of its oxygen very quickly and dump all of its oxygen very quickly. We already talked about the way that carbon dioxide is transported. We said that there are 3 forms that it's transported in: carbonic acid, dissolved carbon dioxide in the plasma, and bound to proteins. Carbon dioxide bound to proteins is called a carbamino compound because it binds to the amino group in a protein. And I want to talk just a little bit about how the binding of carbon dioxide to hemoglobin can affect hemoglobin's function. So let's say that we have a normal hemoglobin here, right? So here's this hemoglobin. It's like that. And it's got its heme group here. And that heme group is bound to oxygen. I'm going to make this a nice thick line to indicate that it's got a tight binding to oxygen. Well, let's put a CO2 on there. Now we've got, well, when a CO2 binds to this protein, it actually is going to bind just like it would bind to water and make carbonic acid. So it will bind with the carbon here, and it has a double bond here, and then an acid group that's going to ionize. And then from there, it will bind to the end. It usually binds to the tails. But now this charge that you see here, well, that charge is going to have an effect on the shape of the hemoglobin fold, causing it to twist slightly and assume a different shape. That twisting basically squeezes the heme group, shifts it a little bit, makes it so that the heme group has less binding to the oxygen, which makes the oxygen more likely to leave. That means that the more CO2 you have, the more likely it is that CO2 is going to bind to your hemoglobin, and the more likely your hemoglobin is to release your oxygen. That means that your hemoglobin is going to release oxygen at the greatest level when the CO2 concentrations are highest. And where are CO2 concentrations highest? CO2 concentrations are highest in the cells of your body that are burning the most oxygen. Remember, for every oxygen you burn, you make a CO2. So where you need the oxygen the most, that's where CO2 is highest, and that's where you're going to drop off more of your oxygen. Blood is a pretty awesome thing. Well, let's take a look here and see exactly what's happening inside of a red blood cell when it's delivering its oxygen. Well, first we have that event that I was talking about right away. So here we have the CO2. CO2 is polar, but it's not so polar that it can't diffuse through membranes. So it's going to diffuse out of your tissue. You just made a bunch of CO2. It diffuses out of the tissue and it diffuses into a red blood cell. That CO2 combines with that hemoglobin, and that's going to cause the hemoglobin to be more likely to let go of its oxygen. But we know that that's only about 5% of the CO2. most of the CO2 is going to diffuse in the red blood cell, and then it's going to be converted by carbonic anhydrase into carbonic acid, which will then dissociate into bicarbonate, right here, and an acid proton. This bicarbonate is shifted out of the red blood cell through an antiporter that shifts a chloride in. That's so that the charges remain balanced. If you're shifting something negative out, you have to shift something negative in, otherwise you end up polarizing your cell. But what happens to this proton here, this acidic proton? Well, that acidic proton actually binds to the heme on hemoglobin. Yes, remember that heme on hemoglobin? Some of those nitrogens that correspond to the iron, it's actually not the heme on the hemoglobin. It actually binds to one of the protein subunits that's right next to the hemoglobin. But still, it's something that is touching right next to that iron. And when that hydrogen binds to it, it changes its charge, and that deactivates the iron, making the iron more likely to release O2. So the more CO2 you get coming into the cell, the more acid you make, the more acidic things become, the more likely you are to release oxygen. Again, the cells that have the most need of oxygen make the most CO2, make the most acid, and that acid automatically, biochemically, signals that hemoglobin to release oxygen. So the more metabolic load you have to carry, the more that red blood cell is going to give up its oxygen. So there are two things that can affect the way, well, there's more than two things. There's two things I'm going to talk about that can affect the way that hemoglobin carries oxygen. First is temperature, right? So we can see here at normal body temperature, slightly above normal body temperature, but 38 degrees. Depends on exactly where in the body you're measuring. This is our cooperative binding curve for hemoglobin. You look at the PO2, and you can see what percentage of hemoglobin is bound to oxygen. This percent saturation of hemoglobin means what percentage of hemoglobin is bound to oxygen. If we look at, if you'll recall, oxygenated blood, fully oxygenated blood that's right in the lungs, the partial pressure of O2 in there is around 100. It's actually about 95. We go up here and we take a look how much of our hemoglobin is saturated. Well, it's about 98% of our hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen. That's pretty normal. What about in the deep tissues? Well, if you remember back, we said that in the tissues, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 40. So we'll look up here, and in the tissues, go up here, how much saturation do we have? We have about, 78, 79, something like that. How much of our oxygen have we let go of by the time we reach the tissues? Well, if you take 98 minus 78, we've dropped off about 20%. So 20% of the oxygen, the total oxygen carrying capacity, is what we have let go of by the time we get to our deep tissue. That's all well and good, but let's say that this person, this hypothetical person, is at 20 degrees Celsius instead of 38 degrees Celsius. First off, if he's at 20 degrees Celsius, he's probably dead, but let's pretend that he's not dead for some reason. What's going to happen? Well, in his lungs, we'll go here, look up, and we'll see, he's at almost 100% saturation, right? So he's got plenty of oxygen in his blood. And then we look at that 40 level down in the tissues, and what is he at? He's at about 95. So how much of his oxygen has he dropped off? He's dropped off about 5%. That's not enough oxygen to keep you alive. That's one of the reasons why this guy's dead. Let's take a look in the other direction. Let's move them up to 43 degrees Celsius. Now, again, if your blood is at 43 degrees Celsius, you're probably dead. But let's just pretend for a second that he isn't. So let's take a look here at a partial pressure of 95. We look up here and we see, well, what are we at? We're at about 93, 94 percent saturation of hemoglobin. That's not bad. Let's go down to the deep tissues, right? Here we have, what is it equilibrating with? A partial pressure of 40. Let's look up on the graph and see how much do we have left? Well, about 63, 64. So how much percentage-wise have we dropped off? Now we've dropped off about 30%. So with this blue line, we've dropped off about 20%. With this green line, we've dropped off like 5%. And with the red line, we've dropped off 30%. So the hotter you are, the more oxygen you're going to drop off. Does that make sense? Well, what could cause your body to heat up? There's two things that come to mind to me right away. Exercise causes your body to heat up because your mitochondria are burning more oxygen. That releases more energy. Some of that energy is captured in the form of ATP, but a lot of it isn't. It escapes as waste heat. We all know that you heat up when you are exercising. Do you think that you might want to drop off more oxygen in your tissues when you are exercising? Does that make sense? Yes, it does. So it would make sense that hemoglobin releases more oxygen when you're hot. What else might make your body abnormally hot? If you're running a fever, that means that you are infected, quite likely, with something that your immune system is fighting off. As anyone who's ever been sick knows, that's a very energy-intensive process. Your body is going to need a lot of energy to make white blood cells, to regenerate tissue, to do all sorts of other things that are involved in the immune process. Do you think that if you're going to be using that much energy, you might need a little bit more oxygen? Yes, you would. And so that extra heat, that raise in temperature that your body does on purpose when you get a fever, helps your hemoglobin to deliver somewhat more oxygen to your tissues. The other thing that affects how hemoglobin carries oxygen is something that we already talked about, and that is pH. But I want to throw some numbers on that, right? So we look here, this blue line again is the normal blood pH. Your blood's normal pH is at about 7.4. Your blood is slightly alkali. And we see again, you look at, at 95 partial pressure, it's a partial pressure in the lungs. You've got about a 98% saturation. You look in the tissues at 40%, and you've got about a 75% saturation. This is a slightly different curve because it's at 37 rather than 38 degrees, but who cares? All right? Okay, let's say that your blood is more acidic. What could cause your blood to be more acidic? Well, let's think about it. If your blood is more acidic, it may mean that you are producing more CO2 because your body is burning more energy. More CO2 means more acid. What else could lead to your body being more acidic? Well, what happens with your muscles when you can't get oxygen to them fast enough? What do? They move to lactic acid fermentation. What do you think lactic acid is going to do to the pH of your blood? Well, it's called lactic acid, so it's probably going to lower that pH, make your blood more acidic, particularly in the local area of the muscle that is needing that oxygen. So what happens when you acidify your blood? Well, we start off in the lungs. We'll assume that the pH is normal in the lungs, but then you get to the tissue, and your tissues are more acidic because you're making more carbon dioxide, or you're making lactic acid. Boom. Let's take a look up here. How much oxygen have you dropped off? Well, now you've dropped off 65%. So, now you're at 65, so you've dropped off 35%. So with this blue line here, you've dropped off 25%. And with this red line, you have dropped off 35% of your blood. And that is a not insignificant amount more that you're putting out because your blood is more acidic, and that indicates to your blood, to your hemoglobin. Again, there's no nerve going on here. It's not making a decision or anything like that. There's a purely biochemical effect that causes your blood to unload more oxygen in the presence of an acid. What if you go the other direction? Let's say that you go to a more basic blood. What could cause a more basic blood? Well, there are several pathological conditions that could, but generally speaking, your body's more likely to make acid than it is to make base. Your body doesn't make very many bases. It makes CO2. CO2 is an acid. The only thing that's commonly going to make your blood more basic is getting rid of too much CO2. How does your body get rid of CO2? You breathe it out. So, a higher blood pH could indicate that you're hyperventilating. If you breathe out rapidly, you're breathing out excess CO2, which means that you're removing acid from your blood, making your blood more basic. What happens then? Well, let's take a look here. And the deep tissues, what's happening? Well, you're only dropping off about 85. Your percent saturation's at about 85%, which means that you're only dropping off about 15% of your oxygen. So you are releasing less oxygen to your tissues when you hyperventilate. This is why, if you've ever hyperventilated, if you've ever been in a panic attack situation, or if you just did it for fun or whatever, you'll notice that you get lightheaded. Why do you think that is? It's because your blood, now that it's more basic, is dropping off less oxygen. How do you think your brain feels about that? Your brain is one of the most oxygen-demanding organs in your body. When it's suddenly getting 15% oxygen instead of 25% oxygen, it complains. It starts to shut down. And that's why you get lightheaded, why you get dizzy. Eventually, you can actually cause yourself to pass out as your brain tries to conserve energy because it's getting less oxygen. So what do we call these effects? Well, if your blood becomes acidic, we call that acidosis. Acidosis is technically any blood pH lower than 7.35. If your blood rises in pH, becomes more basic, we call that alkalosis. Alkalosis is any blood pH higher than 7.45. In between 7.35 and 7.45 is a normal variable range, depending upon what you're doing. You're exercising, you're sitting on the couch, you just had a big meal, who knows? What can cause acidosis and alkalosis? Well, alkalosis is frequently caused by hypocapnia. Hypocapnia means too little CO2 in the blood. This is actually, it's the most common cause of alkalosis, but by far it's the most common cause of alkalosis. So hypocapnia, too little CO2 in the blood, causes alkalosis. Hypercapnia, too much CO2 in the blood, that's more than 43 millimeters of mercury, causes acidosis. It is the most common cause of acidosis, but there are more causes of acidosis than alkalosis. More of the things that your body makes are going to be acidic than basic. It's the way the chemistry works. So, for instance, you could have ketoacidosis if you're diabetic or if you're on a starvation diet or something like that. You don't have any sugar in your blood, or your body thinks you don't have any sugar in your blood, so it goes to a ketone metabolism. Ketones add acid to the blood and can cause your blood to become more acidic. So you may see acidosis in response to ketone metabolism. But the most common cause of acidosis is hypercapnia, too much CO2 in the blood. Now, what could cause there to be too much or too little CO2 in the blood? Again, the primary controller of blood pH is carbon dioxide. And the primary controller of carbon dioxide in the blood is your respiration. So, most forms of acidosis are respiratory acidosis. That can result from having too little gas exchange in your lungs. This could be from hypoventilation, you're not breathing fast enough, or it could be from a problem with the lungs that maybe you have pneumonia or emphysema or some other problem that's preventing gas exchange in your lungs. But again, there are other forms of acidosis. Most forms of alkalosis are respiratory alkalosis. Your body doesn't make too many alkali things, and if you have respiratory alkalosis, this usually results from hyperventilation. Hyperventilation can be good. Like when you're exercising, you breathe fast. Why do you think that is? Well, your body is making more CO2. That additional CO2 makes your blood more acidic. Your brain has chemoreceptors inside of it that can sense, the pH is dropping. We'd better increase our rate of respiration to get rid of some of this acid. That's why you breathe fast when you're exercising. But what if you breathe fast not because you're exercising, but because you're freaking out about your A&P test? Well, then in that case, you're blowing off a lot of CO2, but you're not actually making a lot of CO2 because you're not exercising. You're just freaking out. That raises your blood pH, meaning that your blood will be highly saturated with oxygen. There's no problem with the amount of oxygen that your blood has, but it's not dumping that oxygen. It's no longer dropping off that oxygen in the right place. Your brain starts freaking out. It says, hey, we're not getting enough oxygen. We need more oxygen. Breathe faster. So you breathe faster. But you've got plenty of oxygen. Breathing faster isn't going to help. Breathing faster just makes your CO2 levels go down even more, making it more hard to deliver oxygen to the brain. And the brain continues freaking out, going, we're not getting oxygen, breathe more. And this eventually can result in you passing out. That, by the way, is a description of hyperventilation syndrome, which can be a behavioral or neurological or psychological disorder. It's often a result of chronic or acute anxiety or stress, and it's actually pretty common. It's not too dangerous, but it is pretty common. All right, so that's what I have to tell you guys about blood and how blood is going to transfer gases around the body. Tune in next week, and we're going to talk about the clotting factors and how blood clotting works to prevent blood loss and to promote healing.